In the mountains of northern Persia, carved into a cliff face that seemed to touch the very edge of heaven itself, stood a fortress that would become the beating heart of terror for over 2 centuries. They called it Alamut, the eagle's nest, and from within its stone walls emerged a force so calculated, so precise, so utterly devoted to their cause that even today, nearly 800 years after their destruction, their name alone sends a chill down the spine of anyone who dares to speak it. The Order of Assassins. But here's what history doesn't want you to know. These weren't random killers driven by madness or greed. They weren't thugs hiding in alleyways waiting for the highest bidder. No, the assassins operated according to a code so intricate, so methodically crafted, that it transformed ordinary men into instruments of calculated death. They had rules, they had purpose, and most terrifyingly of all, they had a philosophy that justified every single blade that found its mark. Tonight, we're going to pull back the veil on the most secretive organization in medieval history. We're going to explore the dark code that governed every aspect of their existence, from the moment a young recruit first set foot in Alamut to the final breath of a master assassin completing his sacred mission. Because what you're about to discover isn't just the story of a group of killers, it's the blueprint for how faith, when twisted by brilliant minds, can become the most dangerous weapon humanity has ever created. I'm going to show you training methods so intense they bordered on brainwashing. Initiation rituals that stripped away every trace of the person you used to be. And a hierarchy so perfectly designed that a single word from the top could set in motion the death of kings, sultans, and crusader lords across the known world. But most chilling of all, I'm going to reveal the psychological techniques they used to make their followers not just willing to kill, but eager to die in the process. You see, when most people think of the assassins, they picture Hollywood's version. Hooded figures leaping across rooftops, hidden blades extending from leather gauntlets. But the reality was far more terrifying, because it was far more human. These were men who had been systematically rebuilt from the ground up, their minds reshaped according to principles that turned devotion into the ultimate weapon. And here's the part that should keep you awake at night. Their methods worked. For over 200 years, they held the most powerful empires of their age in a state of constant fear. Sultans changed their sleeping arrangements. Crusader kings doubled their bodyguards. Islamic scholars refused to speak publicly against their doctrine. All because somewhere in the mountains of Persia, men in simple robes were following a code that made them more dangerous than entire armies. So settle in, because we're about to journey into the mind of the medieval world's most feared organization. And by the time we're finished, you'll understand exactly why the word assassin has echoed through history as both a title and a curse. The story begins not with blood, but with books. In the year 1090, a man named Hassan-i-Sabbah stood at the gates of Alamut fortress, but he didn't storm those walls with an army. He conquered them with something far more powerful than swords or siege engines. He conquered them with ideas. Hassan wasn't a warrior in the traditional sense. He was a scholar, a theologian, a man who understood that the human mind could be shaped and molded like clay in the hands of a master craftsman. And what he was about to create within the walls of Alamut would become the most sophisticated system of psychological conditioning the medieval world had ever seen. But to understand the dark code that would govern the assassins, we first need to understand the man who wrote it. Hassan-i-Sabbah was born into a world torn apart by religious and political conflict. The great Islamic empire was fracturing. Sunni Muslims fought Shia Muslims. Turkish sultans battled Arab caliphs. And in the midst of this chaos, Hassan saw an opportunity to create something entirely new. Not just another army, not just another kingdom, but an organization that could operate in the shadows, striking at the heart of power itself. The genius of Hassan's approach lay in his understanding of human nature. He knew that men would fight for gold, they would fight for land, they would even fight for glory. But those motivations were temporary. Gold could be spent, land could be lost, glory faded with time. But faith? Faith, when properly cultivated, could burn in a man's heart like an eternal flame, and Hassan intended to be the one who controlled that flame. The first principle of the Assassin's Code was deceptively simple: total submission to the will of the master of Alamut. But this wasn't the crude obedience of a slave to his owner. This was something far more sophisticated. Hassan understood that true power came not from forcing men to obey, but from making them want to obey, from making them believe that obedience was not just their duty, but their salvation. And so, the Dark Code began with recruitment. Not just anyone could become an assassin. Hassan's agents scoured the Islamic world, looking for specific types of men. Young men, usually between the ages of 15 and 25. Intelligent men, capable of learning complex lessons. But most importantly, desperate men. Men who had lost everything. Men whose families had been destroyed by war. Men whose communities had been shattered by political upheaval. These were the raw materials from which Hassan would forge his perfect weapons. Because a man who has nothing left to lose is a man who can be convinced that death is not an ending, but a beginning. When a potential recruit was identified, he wasn't simply dragged to Alamut in chains. No, the process was far more subtle than that. The recruit would be approached by what appeared to be a simple merchant, or perhaps a wandering scholar. Conversations would be struck up about philosophy, about religion, about the injustices of the world. Seeds of doubt would be planted about the existing order. Questions would be raised about whether the current rulers truly deserved their power. This could go on for months. The potential recruit might not even realize he was being evaluated, tested, gradually prepared for what agents were patient. They understood that there was to come. But Hassan's mind, like a fortress, could not be taken by direct assault. It had to be undermined slowly, carefully, until the walls came tumbling down from within. Only when a recruit was deemed ready would he receive the invitation. Not a command, but an invitation to come and learn, to discover truths that had been hidden from him his entire life, to become part of something greater than himself. And when that young man finally made the journey to Alamut, when he finally passed through those fortress gates, his old life ended forever, because what awaited him inside was a transformation so complete, so total, that he would emerge as an entirely different person. A person whose every thought, every desire, every breath would be dedicated to serving the will of Hassan Isaba. The physical structure of Alamut itself was designed to reinforce this transformation. The fortress was built in concentric circles, each one representing a different level of initiation into the mysteries of the order. New recruits were confined to the outer circle, where they lived in simple cells and spent their days in basic training. Not just physical training, though that was certainly part of it, but intellectual and spiritual training as well. They learned to read and write in multiple languages. They studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine. They memorized vast portions of the Quran and learned to recite complex theological arguments. But most importantly, they learned the fundamental principle that would govern every aspect of their lives from that moment forward. Nothing is true. Everything is permitted. This wasn't just a motto. It was a complete philosophical framework that shattered every assumption the recruits had ever held about right and wrong, good and evil, seahood. Hassan Truth and Fal taught them that all the rules they had been raised to follow, all the moral boundaries they had been taught to respect, were nothing more than artificial constructs created by those in power to keep the masses in line. If nothing was true, then there were no absolute moral laws. If everything was permitted, then any action could be justified if it served the greater purpose of the order. Murder wasn't evil if it removed a tyrant from power. Deception wasn't wrong if it protected the mission. Even betraying one's own family wasn't a sin if the master commanded it. This philosophical indoctrination was reinforced through a carefully designed system of rewards and punishments. Recruits who embraced the teachings were gradually allowed access to the inner circles of the fortress. They were given better food, more comfortable quarters, access to the extensive library that Hassan had assembled. But those who resisted, who clung to their old beliefs and moral frameworks, found themselves facing increasingly harsh conditions. Not physical torture, mind you. Hassan was too sophisticated for such crude methods. Instead, resistant recruits would find themselves isolated from their peers. They would be denied access to the communal meals that were such an important part of fortress life. They would be excluded from the philosophical discussions that formed the intellectual heart of the community. Most men, faced with this kind of social isolation, would eventually break. They would abandon their resistance and embrace the teachings of the order. But for those few who continued to resist, there was a final test. They accept the code would be given a choice, completely and unconditionally, or leave Alamut forever. But here's the truly diabolical part. By the time a recruit reached this point, he had already been cut off from the outside world for months or even years. His old life, his old identity, his old connections had all been systematically severed. He had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The order had become his entire world. And so, faced with the choice between total submission and complete exile, almost every recruit chose submission. They didn't just accept the code, they embraced it. They made it part of themselves so completely that questioning it became literally unthinkable. This was the first great secret of the assassin's dark code. They didn't create killers through violence or coercion. They created them through a process of psychological reconstruction, so complete that the end result was a human being who genuinely believed that murder could be an act of devotion, that death could be a form of worship, that serving the will of Hassani Saba was the highest possible calling any man could aspire to. But the code went far deeper than simple obedience. Once a recruit had been fully indoctrinated into the basic philosophy of the order, his real education could begin, and what he would learn next would transform him from a mere follower into something far more dangerous, a weapon with a human face, capable of walking among enemies undetected, of winning trust and friendship, all while planning the perfect moment to strike. The second phase of training took place in the middle circles of Alamut, where recruits learned the practical skills they would need to carry out their missions. But even these seemingly straightforward lessons were infused with the twisted logic of the code. They learned to kill, yes, but not in the way you might expect. The assassins weren't taught to be berserkers or wild butchers. Instead, they were trained in what Hassan called the art of the single strike. Every lesson was built around precision, patience, and the understanding that a true assassin should never need to kill more than one person to achieve his objective. The weapons training was unlike anything practiced in the conventional armies of the time. While knights learned to swing heavy swords and wield massive axes, the assassins mastered the dagger. But this wasn't just about the weapon itself. The dagger was symbolic of their entire philosophy. Small, concealable, requiring skill rather than brute strength. A weapon that could be carried by anyone, anywhere, without drawing attention. They practiced for hours each day, not just learning to strike quickly and accurately, but learning to strike with absolute certainty. There were no practice rounds in the field, no second chances. When an assassin drew his blade, his target had to die on the first attempt, because there would never be an opportunity for a second. But the physical training was only half of what made these men so terrifyingly effective. The other half was something far more insidious. They were taught to become anyone, to blend into any environment, to earn the trust of anyone they might need to get close to. This wasn't simple disguise or play acting. This was a complete psychological transformation that allowed them to literally become different people as the mission required. An assassin might spend months learning to pose as a merchant, studying the intricacies of trade routes and commercial practices, until he could discuss profit margins with the most experienced businessmen. Another might train as a religious scholar, memorizing theological texts and learning to debate fine points of Islamic law with genuine expertise. Others learned to become servants, guards, entertainers, even beggars. The key was authenticity. These weren't superficial disguises that would crumble under scrutiny. Hassan's training methods produced men who could live alternate lives so completely that even they sometimes seemed to forget which identity was real and which was constructed. And this points to perhaps the most chilling aspect of the assassin's code: the complete erasure of individual identity. By the time an assassin completed his training, there was nothing left of the person he used to be. His old name, his old family, his old dreams and desires, all of it had been systematically stripped away and replaced with something new, something that existed solely to serve the will of the master. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate strategy based on Hassan's deep understanding of human psychology. He knew that men with strong personal attachments could be corrupted, could be turned against the order through threats or bribes directed at the people they cared about. But a man who had no personal attachments, no individual desires, no sense of self separate from his mission, such a man was incorruptible. The training in the middle circles could last for years. Some recruits never progressed beyond this level, instead becoming the support structure that kept Alamut functioning. They served as teachers for newer recruits, as craftsmen maintaining the fortress, as scholars preserving and expanding the Order's vast collection of knowledge. But for those who showed exceptional aptitude, who demonstrated not just skill, but the kind of absolute devotion that Hassan was looking for, there was another level waiting. The inner circle of Alamut was reserved for the elite. The Fidai, as they were known, the devoted ones. These were the men who would actually carry out the assassinations that made the Order famous. But even among the Fidai, there were gradations of rank and responsibility, each one corresponding to deeper levels of initiation into Hassan's most closely guarded secrets. To reach this level, a recruit had to demonstrate something beyond mere competence or obedience. He had to show that he had internalized the code so completely that following it had become as natural as breathing. He had to prove that he could kill without hesitation, die without fear, and maintain absolute secrecy even under the most extreme duress. The final test was both simple and horrifying. The candidate would be given a mission, but not just any mission. He would be ordered to kill someone he had grown close to during his years of training, perhaps another recruit who had become a friend, perhaps an instructor who had shown him kindness, perhaps even a family member who had somehow maintained contact with him despite the Order's isolation protocols. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was the ultimate verification that the candidate had truly transcended all human attachments, that his loyalty to the Order was absolute and unshakable. Those who hesitated, who showed any sign of personal feeling or moral conflict, were quietly eliminated. They knew too much to be allowed to leave, and they lacked the total dedication necessary to be trusted with the Order's deepest secrets. But those who passed this final test, who could kill without emotion, and then calmly return to their daily routines as if nothing had happened, these men became something unprecedented in human history. They became Hassan's perfect weapons, human beings who had been so thoroughly reprogrammed that they felt genuine joy in carrying out murders, who experienced religious ecstasy in the moment of their own deaths. The psychology behind this transformation was incredibly sophisticated for its time. Hassan had essentially discovered what modern psychologists would later call conditioning and systematic desensitization. Through careful manipulation of reward and punishment, through gradual exposure to increasingly extreme situations, through the systematic removal of all competing loyalties and attachments, he had created human beings who were psychologically incapable of disobedience. But the code didn't just govern how assassins were trained, it also dictated how they operated once they were deployed into the world. And these operational protocols were every bit as carefully crafted as the training methods that produced them. Every assassination was planned according to strict guidelines that had been developed over decades of trial and error. The target had to be verified through multiple independent sources. The political ramifications had to be carefully considered. The method had to be chosen not just for effectiveness, but for the message it would send to other potential enemies of the order. Most importantly, the assassination had to be carried out in a way that would maximize the psychological impact on witnesses. It wasn't enough to simply kill someone quietly and disappear. The death had to be public, dramatic, unmistakably the work of the assassins. Because fear was just as important a weapon as the dagger itself. This is why so many assassin attacks took place in crowded marketplaces, in the middle of religious ceremonies, during important political gatherings. The assassin would emerge from the crowd, strike his target with calm precision, and then make no attempt to escape. Instead, he would stand calmly, sometimes even smiling, as the guards cut him down. This willingness to die, this apparent eagerness for martyrdom, was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the entire operation. Witnesses couldn't understand it. How could someone kill with such composure and then accept death with what looked like joy? It defied everything they thought they knew about human nature, and that was exactly the point. Hassan had created something that seemed supernatural, inhuman. His assassins appeared to be men, but they acted according to logic that no ordinary person could comprehend. This made them seem almost like demons or jinn, creatures from beyond the natural world who could take human form but followed entirely different rules. The code even governed how assassins were supposed to behave in the moments leading up to their deaths. They were taught specific phrases to recite, specific gestures to make, ways of looking at their executioners that would maximize the psychological impact of the moment. Even in death, they remained weapons in service to the order. This psychological warfare extended far beyond the moment of assassination itself. The code required that every aspect of an operation be designed to plant seeds of paranoia that would continue growing long after the assassin was dead. The target's death was just the beginning. The real victory came in the weeks and months that followed, as those who witnessed the killing began to question everything they thought they knew about their own security. Who else among their trusted advisors might be an assassin in disguise? How long had the killer been living among them, learning their routines, studying their weaknesses? If someone could infiltrate their innermost circle so completely, what did that say about their ability to protect themselves from future attacks? This is why Hassan's code placed such emphasis on what he called the long game. Assassins weren't just trained to complete single missions. They were prepared to maintain deep cover identities for years if necessary, building relationships, earning trust, working their way closer and closer to their eventual targets. Some spent decades living as loyal servants, trusted advisors, even close friends of the men they were ultimately destined to kill. The patience required for this approach was inhuman by normal standards. But then again, Hassan's training had systematically removed everything human from his followers. They didn't experience loneliness during their long years of isolation. They didn't feel guilt about the friendships they were cultivating under false pretenses. They didn't struggle with doubt or second thoughts about their missions. Instead, they experienced what Hassan taught them to interpret as spiritual fulfillment. Every day spent in preparation was a day of worship. Every lie told to build their cover was a prayer offered to the true faith. Every moment of patient waiting brought them closer to the ecstatic release of completing their sacred duty. The code also established elaborate protocols for communication between Alamut and its agents in the field. Given the distances involved and the need for absolute secrecy, this was no simple matter. Hassan's solution was characteristically ingenious and reveals just how far ahead of his time he truly was in understanding the mechanics of covert operations. Rather than relying on traditional messengers who might be captured and interrogated, the order developed a system of coded communications that could be embedded in seemingly innocent activities. A merchant's trade routes might spell out a message when plotted on a map. The arrangement of goods in a marketplace stall could indicate whether an operation should proceed or be delayed. Even the timing of religious observances could carry coded instructions to sleeper agents scattered across the Islamic world. These communication networks were built in layers, with each level of the organization knowing only what they needed to know to perform their specific function. A message might pass through dozens of intermediaries before reaching its final destination, with none of them understanding the true meaning of what they were conveying. This compartmentalization made the system incredibly resilient. Even if one link in the chain was compromised, the damage could be contained. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of Hassan's communication system was how it used the existing infrastructure of medieval society. Pilgrims traveling to Mecca, scholars moving between centers of learning, traders following established commercial routes, all of these provided perfect cover for the order's messengers. The communications network piggybacked on legitimate activities that were already happening, making it nearly impossible for enemies to detect or disrupt. The code governing these communications was as strict as everything else in the order's operations. Messages were to be transmitted exactly as received, with no embellishments or interpretations. Agents were forbidden from attempting to decode instructions that weren't meant for them. Any deviation from established protocols was considered a form of betrayal, punishable by death. This obsession with precision and security extended to every aspect of how the order operated. Even the weapons used by assassins were standardized according to specific requirements laid out in the code. The daggers weren't just tools for killing. They were symbols, carefully designed to send particular messages to those who found them. The blades were forged from the finest steel, with distinctive patterns that marked them unmistakably as products of Alamut's workshops. The handles were carved with symbols that had meaning within the order's esoteric belief system. Even the leather sheaths were crafted according to precise specifications, designed to allow for quick, silent draws while remaining completely concealed beneath normal clothing. But the most chilling detail was what happened to these weapons after they were used. According to the code, an assassin was required to leave his dagger embedded in his target's body. This wasn't just a practical consideration, though it did ensure that the weapon couldn't be turned against the killer in his final moments. It was a signature, a calling card, that announced to the world that this death was the work of Hassan Saba and his devoted followers. The psychological impact of this practice cannot be overstated. When a political or religious leader was found dead with an Alamut dagger protruding from his chest, everyone who saw the scene understood immediately what had happened. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random act of violence. This was an execution carried out according to a higher authority, a judgment rendered by forces that seemed to operate beyond the reach of normal human law. The code even specified how assassins should prepare themselves spiritually in the hours before carrying out their missions. These weren't just practical preparations like checking weapons or reviewing escape routes. These were elaborate rituals designed to put the killer in the proper mental state to commit murder and embrace martyrdom. The assassin would fast for 3 days before the operation, consuming nothing but water and small amounts of bread. This wasn't just about maintaining physical readiness. Hassan taught that hunger purified the soul, clearing away earthly distractions and allowing the killer to focus entirely on his sacred duty. During this period of fasting, the assassin would also engage in intensive prayer and meditation, reciting specific verses from the Quran that had been reinterpreted according to the order's teachings. These weren't the familiar prayers that ordinary Muslims might recognize. They were esoteric formulations that reinforced the psychological conditioning the killer had undergone during his years of training. The final night before the mission was spent in what Hassan called the contemplation of paradise. The assassin would be given access to special chambers within whatever safe house the order maintained in the target city. These rooms were decorated with elaborate tapestries, filled with exotic perfumes, furnished with the finest carpets and cushions available. Here, the killer would spend his last night on Earth in what was presented as a foretaste of the rewards awaiting him in the afterlife. He would be served the finest food and wine, entertained by musicians and storytellers, surrounded by every luxury that medieval society could provide. But this wasn't simple indulgence. It was the final stage of a conditioning process, that had been years in the making. Throughout the night, between the music and the feasting, the assassin would be reminded again and again of the teachings that had shaped his understanding of existence. Death was not an ending, but a transition. The mission he was about to undertake wasn't murder but justice. The fear and pain he might cause his target were insignificant compared to the cosmic importance of the Order's work. By morning, when the time came to actually carry out the assassination, the killer would be in a state that can only be described as religious ecstasy. He wasn't just ready to die for his cause. He was eager to do so, convinced that his death would transform him into something greater than he had ever been in life. This is what made Hassan's assassins so terrifyingly effective. They weren't just willing to trade their lives for their target's death. They genuinely believed that making this trade was the most wonderful thing that could possibly happen to them. They approached their final missions not with grim determination, but with joy, not with fear, but with anticipation. The code that governed these final preparations was incredibly detailed, covering everything from the specific prayers to be recited to the proper way of holding the dagger during the killing stroke. Nothing was left to chance or personal interpretation. Every gesture, every word, every thought had been choreographed according to Hassan's vision of the perfect assassination. But the dark code went even deeper than the mechanics of individual operations. It also established the philosophical framework that justified the Order's existence and gave meaning to its actions. This wasn't just a collection of rules for training killers and carrying out murders. It was a complete worldview that reinterpreted the fundamental nature of good and evil, justice and oppression, life and death. At the heart of this philosophy was Hassan's teaching that the existing political and religious order was fundamentally corrupt and illegitimate. The sultans who claimed to rule by divine right were usurpers. The clerics who interpreted Islamic law were charlatans more interested in their own power than in serving God. The entire structure of medieval society was built on lies and maintained through violence against the innocent. In this context, assassination wasn't murder, it was correction. The assassins weren't killers. They were surgeons, removing diseased tissue from the body politic so that true health could be restored. Every death they caused was justified by the greater good it would ultimately serve. This philosophy was supported by an elaborate reinterpretation of Islamic theology that Hassan had developed during his years of study before founding the Order. He taught that the Quran contained hidden meanings that could only be understood by those who had achieved true spiritual enlightenment. The obvious, literal meanings that ordinary Muslims focused on were actually distractions designed to keep the masses ignorant of deeper truths. According to Hassan's teachings, the true message of Islam supported the Order's mission. The Prophet Muhammad himself had been forced to use deception and violence against his enemies. The early Muslim community had survived only through the willingness of devoted followers to sacrifice their lives for the greater good. What the assassins were doing was simply following this sacred precedent. This theological framework was essential to the Order's success because it provided an unshakable justification for actions that might otherwise have seemed monstrous even to the killers themselves. No matter how innocent a target might appear, no matter how much suffering an assassination might cause to the victim's family and followers, the philosophical structure Hassan had created could absorb and rationalize any moral objection. The code also established strict hierarchies within the Order that reflected Hassan's understanding of human nature and the requirements of effective conspiracy. Not everyone could be trusted with the same level of knowledge or responsibility. The organization was structured in concentric circles, with each level knowing only what was necessary for their particular role. At the outermost level were the ordinary supporters who provided funding, safe houses, and logistical support without understanding the true nature of what they were supporting. They might think they were contributing to a religious movement or a political cause, never realizing that their donations were being used to train killers. Moving inward, there were the active agents who carried out intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and support operations. These men knew they were part of something covert and dangerous, but they weren't necessarily aware of the Order's ultimate objectives or methods. Closer to the center were the trainers and administrators who ran the day-to-day operations at Alamut and other strongholds. These men understood the Order's mission and methods, but they weren't privy to the highest levels of strategic planning. Finally, at the very center were Hassan himself and a small circle of absolute initiates who knew everything. These were the men who decided which targets to select, when operations should be launched, how the Order's resources should be allocated. They were the guardians of the complete code, the keepers of all the Order's secrets. This compartmentalized structure served multiple purposes. It provided security, ensuring that no single captured agent could compromise the entire organization. It allowed for plausible deniability, since lower-level members could honestly claim ignorance of activities they hadn't been briefed on, and it created a sense of mystery and aspiration that motivated members to prove their worthiness for advancement to higher levels of initiation. The code governing advancement through these levels was as rigorous as everything else in Hassan's system. Promotion wasn't based on seniority or personal connections. It was earned through demonstrated competence, absolute loyalty, and the successful completion of increasingly difficult assignments. But here's what made this hierarchy truly diabolical. Each level of advancement required the candidate to commit acts that would make it impossible for him to ever leave the Order. A man who had simply provided funding could potentially walk away and resume a normal life. But a man who had participated in planning an assassination, who had helped train killers, who had carried out murders himself, such a man was bound to the Order forever. Hassan understood that the most effective form of loyalty wasn't love or admiration. It was complicity. Once a man had blood on his hands, once he had committed acts that would be considered crimes by the outside world, he had no choice but to continue serving the organization that had led him down this path. His survival depended on the Order's continued success and secrecy. This is how Hassan built an organization that lasted for nearly 2 centuries, despite facing opposition from some of the most powerful empires in the medieval world. He didn't just create a group of killers. He created a self-perpetuating system that could survive the death of its founder, that could adapt to changing circumstances, that could continue operating even when its most important strongholds were captured or destroyed. The dark code of the assassins was more than just a set of rules or a training manual. It was a complete blueprint for creating and maintaining the kind of organization that most people couldn't even imagine, let alone defend against. It was a system so perfectly designed for its purpose that its basic principles would be studied and adapted by intelligence agencies and terrorist organizations for centuries to come. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Hassan's achievement was how completely he had solved the fundamental problem that faces any conspiracy or covert organization. How do you ensure absolute loyalty from people who are being asked to commit terrible acts in service to abstract ideals? How do you maintain operational security when your activities require the cooperation of dozens or even hundreds of people? How do you build something that can survive the inevitable attempts to destroy it? Hassan's answer was the systematic destruction of individual identity and its replacement with something new, something that existed solely to serve the will of the organization. He had discovered how to transform human beings into perfect weapons, creatures that looked and spoke like men but operated according to an entirely different logic. And the most terrifying part? It worked. For over 200 years, the methods codified in Hassan's dark teachings allowed a small group of fanatics to hold the entire Middle East in a state of barely controlled terror. Kings changed their policies based on rumors of assassin displeasure. Religious leaders moderated their teachings to avoid becoming targets. Entire armies were deployed not to conquer territory but to hunt down and destroy a few dozen men hiding in mountain fortresses. This was the true power of the Dark Code. Not just its ability to create individual killers, but its capacity to reshape the behavior of entire societies through the calculated application of fear and uncertainty. The assassins proved that a small group of absolutely devoted followers, operating according to carefully designed principles, could wield influence far beyond what their numbers would suggest was possible. The secret to understanding the true horror of Hassan's creation lies not in the dramatic assassinations that made headlines across the medieval world, but in the quiet moments between missions. Because while the outside world focused on the spectacular deaths of sultans and crusader lords, the real work of the order was happening in the shadows, in the patient cultivation of influence that made those assassinations possible in the first place. You see, Hassan understood something that his enemies never grasped. Terror isn't just about the moment when the blade finds its mark. Terror is about the anticipation, the uncertainty, the growing realization that nowhere is truly safe. And to create that kind of pervasive dread, you need more than just a handful of trained killers. You need a network. The fourth principle of the Dark Code was what Hassan called the web of whispers. For every assassin who actually carried out a killing, there were dozens of others whose job was simply to be seen, to be noticed, to plant the suggestion that the order's reach extended far beyond what anyone could imagine. These weren't fighters or killers in any conventional sense. They were actors, playing roles so convincingly that even they sometimes forgot where the performance ended and reality began. A merchant who traveled between cities, always asking innocent questions about the movements of important people. A scholar who attended religious debates, quietly taking notes on who said what about political matters. A servant in a noble household who never did anything suspicious, but whose presence alone was enough to make his master wonder if every conversation was being reported back to Alamut. The psychological effect of this network was devastating. It created what modern intelligence agencies would recognize as a climate of paranoia, where everyone suspected everyone else of potentially being an enemy agent. Friendships became strained as people wondered if their closest confidants might be reporting their words to hostile forces. Political alliances crumbled as leaders lost trust in their own advisors. But here's the truly diabolical part. Most of these suspected agents weren't actually working for the assassins at all. Hassan had realized that the most effective way to spread fear wasn't to actually infiltrate every household and every court. It was to make people believe that he had done so. The mere possibility that anyone could be an assassin was more powerful than the reality of having spies everywhere. This is where the code's emphasis on symbolism became crucial. The order developed an elaborate system of signs and signals that could be left in public places to suggest their presence. A particular way of arranging stones by a roadside, a specific pattern of cuts on a tree trunk, even something as simple as a piece of cloth tied to a market stall in a particular manner. These symbols were designed to be ambiguous enough that they could have innocent explanations, but distinctive enough that anyone familiar with the order's methods would recognize them immediately. The genius lay in the uncertainty they created. Was that arrangement of objects just a coincidence, or was it a message from the assassins? Most people couldn't be sure, and that uncertainty ate at them like acid. The code required that these symbols be placed not just randomly, but according to carefully calculated patterns designed to maximize psychological impact. They would appear in places where important people were known to travel, always just visible enough to be noticed, but never obvious enough to be definitively identified as threatening. A sultan might find a particular arrangement of flowers outside his palace that seemed to match descriptions he'd heard of assassin calling cards. A religious leader might notice stones placed in a specific pattern near the mosque where he preached. A crusader lord might spot cloth tied to trees along a route he frequently used for hunting. None of these signs necessarily meant anything, but the fact that they could mean something, the possibility that they were deliberate messages from an organization known for turning possibilities into corpses, was enough to change behavior. Routes were altered. Schedules were modified. Extra guards were hired. And with each precaution taken, the legend of the assassins grew stronger. The fifth principle of the code dealt with what Hassan called the architecture of fear. This wasn't just about psychological manipulation, though that was certainly part of it. It was about the physical spaces where the order operated, and how those spaces were designed to reinforce the conditioning of members while simultaneously intimidating visitors. Alamut itself was the masterpiece of this architectural philosophy. The fortress wasn't just built for defense, though it was certainly impregnable by the standards of its time. Every corridor, every chamber, every architectural detail was designed to create specific psychological effects on those who experienced it. New recruits entering the outer courtyards would find themselves in spaces that were deliberately disorienting, passages that seemed to lead somewhere, but actually circled back on themselves. Rooms with multiple entrances and exits that made it impossible to keep track of where you'd been or where you were going, staircases that led to dead ends, or chambers that served no apparent purpose. This wasn't accidental. Hassan understood that disorientation breaks down psychological resistance. When people can't rely on their spatial understanding of their environment, they become more susceptible to other forms of influence. The architecture of Alamut was designed to make visitors feel lost, confused, dependent on their guides for navigation. But as recruits progressed deeper into the fortress, as they advanced through the levels of initiation, the spaces they were allowed to access became more ordered, more comprehensible. The inner chambers, reserved for full initiates, were models of geometric perfection, with clear sightlines and logical layouts that conveyed a sense of mastery and control. This progression wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. The message was clear. Confusion and chaos were the natural state of the outside world, but within the order, within the embrace of Hassan's teachings, everything made sense. The physical environment reinforced the philosophical lessons that were being taught through other means. The code also specified how these spaces should be decorated and furnished. The outer chambers were kept deliberately austere, with bare stone walls and minimal furnishings. But the inner sanctums were filled with treasures that seemed almost magical to men who had never seen such luxury. Silk tapestries from China, carpets from Persia, weapons and armor crafted by the finest artisans of the Islamic world. Again, the message was unmistakable. Loyalty to the order brought rewards not just in the afterlife, but in the here and now. The path from the bare outer chambers to the luxurious inner sanctums was a physical representation of the spiritual journey that Hassan promised to all who followed his teachings. But the most important spaces in Alamut were ones that visitors never saw. Deep beneath the fortress, accessible only through hidden passages known to the highest initiates, were the chambers where the order's most sensitive work was carried out. This was where new assassination techniques were developed and tested, where poisons were brewed and antidotes prepared, where the psychological profiles of potential targets were compiled and analyzed. These underground chambers were designed according to principles that wouldn't seem out of place in a modern research facility. Each room served a specific purpose and was equipped with the tools necessary for that function. There were libraries containing detailed information about political and religious leaders across the known world, workshops where weapons and other specialized equipment were manufactured, even primitive laboratories where chemical compounds were studied and refined. The code governing access to these areas was stricter than anything else in the order's hierarchy. Even senior initiates were only allowed into the chambers relevant to their specific responsibilities. No single person, except Hassan himself, was permitted to know the full extent of what was being done in the depths of Alamut. This compartmentalization served the same purpose as the broader organizational structure. It provided security against infiltration or betrayal, but it also created an aura of mystery that enhanced Hassan's authority. Even his closest followers understood that their master possessed knowledge and capabilities that were hidden from them. This sense of hidden depths, of secrets within secrets, reinforced the religious awe in which Hassan was held by his disciples. The sixth principle of the code addressed what Hassan called the cultivation of legends. He understood that reputation could be as powerful as reality, and he systematically worked to ensure that stories about the assassins would spread far beyond the actual reach of his organization. This wasn't left to chance. The Order maintained networks of storytellers, traveling merchants, and religious pilgrims whose job was to spread carefully crafted tales about assassin capabilities and activities. These stories weren't entirely fictional, but they were deliberately embellished to make the Order seem more numerous, more powerful, and more mysterious than it actually was. A single successful assassination would spawn dozens of variations in the retelling. The killer would become more skilled, the security around the target more elaborate, the escape more miraculous. Details would be added about supernatural abilities, about assassins who could become invisible or who felt no pain. The line between fact and legend became deliberately blurred. But Hassan was careful to ensure that these legends served specific purposes. They weren't just meant to entertain or to enhance the Order's reputation. They were psychological weapons designed to achieve particular strategic objectives. Stories about assassins who had infiltrated royal households and lived undetected for years made rulers paranoid about their own servants. Tales of killers who felt no fear of death made military commanders reluctant to engage in direct confrontation. Legends about the Order's ability to strike anywhere, at any time, made potential enemies think twice before taking actions that might provoke retaliation. The code specified exactly how these stories should be structured to achieve maximum psychological impact. They needed to be believable enough that people wouldn't dismiss them as obvious fiction, but extraordinary enough to inspire fear and awe. They needed to contain just enough specific detail to seem authentic, but not so much that they could be easily verified or debunked. Most importantly, they needed to leave key questions unanswered. The most effective legends were those that created uncertainty rather than providing clear information. People needed to wonder whether a particular story was true, whether the capabilities it described were real, whether they themselves might be at risk. This systematic cultivation of legend extended to Hassan himself. The code required that his followers never speak of their master in ordinary terms. He wasn't just a political or religious leader. He was something approaching a divine figure, possessed of knowledge and powers that transcended normal human limitations. Stories were spread about Hassan's ability to see into the future, to know the thoughts of his enemies, to command supernatural forces. These weren't presented as religious teachings or metaphorical truths. They were related as historical facts, supported by carefully fabricated evidence and eyewitness testimony from trusted sources. The psychological effect of this mythologization was profound. It made Hassan seem less like a human adversary who could be defeated through conventional means, and more like a force of nature that could only be appeased or avoided. Enemies who might have considered direct military action against the Order found themselves hesitating, wondering if they were capable of fighting something that operated according to rules they didn't understand. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Hassan's legend building was how it affected his own followers. The stories they were taught to spread weren't just external propaganda. They were also internal indoctrination tools that reinforced the religious devotion the Order demanded from its members. When an assassin repeated tales of Hassan's supernatural abilities to outsiders, he wasn't just trying to intimidate potential enemies. He was also reinforcing his own belief in his master's divine nature. The act of storytelling became a form of prayer, a way of strengthening the psychological conditioning that made absolute obedience possible. This created a feedback loop that made the Order's mythology increasingly elaborate over time. Each generation of followers added new details to the stories they had inherited, and these embellishments were then incorporated into the official canon of legends that future generations would be taught to spread. The seventh principle of the code dealt with what Hassan called the management of martyrdom. This was perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of the entire system, because it addressed the fundamental challenge that faced any organization asking its members to die for abstract ideals. How do you convince someone to embrace death not just as a possibility, but as a desirable outcome. How do you transform the natural human instinct for self-preservation into something resembling enthusiasm for self-destruction? Hassan's solution was to completely reframe the meaning of death itself. Through intensive theological and philosophical indoctrination, assassins were taught to view their physical existence as a temporary and relatively unimportant stage in a much larger cosmic drama. Their true lives, their real identities, existed on a spiritual plane that transcended the material world. From this perspective, dying in service to the order wasn't an ending. It was a promotion, an elevation to a higher level of existence, where the constraints and sufferings of physical life no longer applied. The moment of death became the moment of ultimate liberation, the point at which the assassin's true nature could finally be revealed. This wasn't just abstract theology. The code specified elaborate rituals and practices designed to make this reframing of death feel emotionally real to the men who would be expected to embrace it. Assassins preparing for missions that would certainly result in their deaths were treated with special reverence by their fellow initiates. They were given access to the finest accommodations the order could provide. They were served the best food, dressed in the finest clothes, treated as honored guests rather than condemned men. But more than that, they were made to feel that they were already beginning their transition to the higher plane of existence they were about to enter. The final days before a suicide mission were structured as a series of increasingly intense spiritual experiences designed to create genuine euphoria in the volunteer. These experiences weren't just psychological manipulation, though they certainly served that purpose. They were also practical training designed to ensure that the assassin would be in the proper mental state to carry out his mission effectively. A man who was genuinely eager to die would be less likely to hesitate at the crucial moment. A killer who believed that death would bring him immediate access to paradise would be more likely to remain calm and focused even as enemy guards closed in around him. The code also specified how other members of the order should respond to successful martyrdom operations. The death of an assassin wasn't mourned as a loss. It was celebrated as a victory, a graduation ceremony marking the volunteer's advancement to a higher level of existence. These celebrations served multiple purposes. They reinforced the theological framework that made martyrdom seem desirable. They provided positive reinforcement for other potential volunteers who might be considering similar sacrifices. And they created a social environment where expressing any reluctance about dying for the cause would mark someone as spiritually inferior to their peers. But Hassan understood that even the most intensive indoctrination couldn't completely eliminate the natural human fear of death. The code therefore included elaborate backup systems designed to ensure that wavering assassins would still carry out their missions even if their enthusiasm began to fade at the crucial moment. Assassins selected for suicide missions were never told the full details of their assignments until the last possible moment. They knew they were being prepared for martyrdom, but they didn't know when or where or how it would happen. This prevented them from dwelling on the specifics and potentially talking themselves out of their commitment. When the time came to actually deploy, they were accompanied by handlers whose job was to provide constant reinforcement and supervision. These handlers were usually senior initiates who had demonstrated absolute reliability and who were themselves prepared to kill the volunteer if he showed any sign of backing out. The actual missions were structured to minimize the opportunities for second thoughts. Once an assassin began his approach to the target, the sequence of events was designed to unfold so rapidly that there would be no time for hesitation or reflection. The volunteer would find himself committed to a course of action that could only end in death before he had a chance to fully process what was happening. This systematic management of martyrdom was perhaps Hassan's greatest innovation, and it was certainly his most influential. The techniques he developed for convincing people to embrace death in service to abstract ideals would be studied and adapted by extremist organizations for centuries to come. The basic principles he established are still recognizable in the methods used by modern terrorist groups to recruit and deploy suicide attackers. But what made Hassan's approach particularly effective was how it was integrated into a larger philosophical framework that gave meaning to every aspect of an assassin's life, not just his death. The willingness to die wasn't something that was imposed on reluctant volunteers. It grew naturally out of the worldview that the order taught and the community it provided. Men who had been stripped of their original identities and rebuilt according to Hassan's specifications didn't see martyrdom as a sacrifice they were being asked to make. They saw it as the natural culmination of the spiritual journey they had been traveling since the day they first entered Alamut. Death in service to the order wasn't something they feared or endured. It was something they genuinely looked forward to as the moment when their true purpose would finally be fulfilled. The eighth and final principle of the Dark Code was what Hassan called the eternal renewal. This dealt with the long-term survival of the organization and its ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character and mission. Hassan understood that no human institution could survive indefinitely without evolving. The political landscape of the medieval Middle East was constantly shifting. New enemies would arise while old ones were defeated or converted. Technologies would change, making some operational methods obsolete while creating opportunities for new approaches. Even the religious and philosophical currents that provided the order's ideological foundation would inevitably be influenced by broader cultural developments. The code therefore included mechanisms for adaptation and renewal that were designed to preserve the order's effectiveness across generations. But these mechanisms were themselves constrained by strict parameters, intended to prevent the kind of drift that might gradually transform the organization into something completely different from Hassan's original vision. The most important of these mechanisms was the systematic preservation and transmission of the order's core knowledge and methods. This wasn't just about maintaining written records, though the libraries of Alamut did contain extensive documentation of operational procedures, target assessments, and strategic analyses. More crucial was the preservation of the psychological and spiritual techniques that made the order's approach to human conditioning so effective. These couldn't be fully captured in written form because they depended on subtle interpersonal dynamics and experiential learning processes that could only be transmitted through direct master-to-student relationships. The code therefore established elaborate protocols for identifying and training the next generation of senior initiates who would be responsible for maintaining these traditions. This wasn't just about finding people with the right skills or knowledge. It was about finding individuals who had internalized Hassan's worldview so completely that they could be trusted to adapt his methods without betraying his fundamental principles. These successors underwent training programs that lasted for decades and involved exposure to every aspect of the order's operations. They weren't just taught how to recruit and condition new members. They were also educated in the strategic thinking that guided target selection, the political analysis that informed operational planning, and the philosophical framework that justified the organization's existence. But perhaps most importantly, they were systematically exposed to the same psychological conditioning processes that were used on ordinary recruits, but at a much deeper and more sophisticated level. They weren't just expected to understand Hassan's methods intellectually. They were required to experience them personally, to undergo the same kind of identity reconstruction that transformed volunteers into perfect weapons. This ensured that future leaders of the order wouldn't just be administrators or managers. They would be true believers who had been shaped by the same forces that created the organization's rank-and-file members. They would be capable of making the kind of decisions that Hassan himself would have made, because they would be thinking with minds that had been rebuilt according to his specifications. The code also established procedures for maintaining operational security across generational transitions. Knowledge was compartmentalized not just horizontally, between different functional areas, but also vertically, across different time periods. Senior initiates were given access to historical information about past operations and strategic decisions, but only to the extent necessary for them to understand current policies and procedures. This prevented any single individual from gaining a comprehensive understanding of the order's complete history and methods. Even the most senior leaders knew only what they needed to know to fulfill their specific responsibilities. The full picture existed only in the collective memory of the organization as a whole, distributed across multiple individuals in a way that made it nearly impossible for any single person to compromise the entire system. But the most sophisticated aspect of Hassan's renewal mechanism was how it balanced continuity with adaptation. The order needed to be able to respond to new challenges and opportunities, but it also needed to maintain the essential characteristics that made it effective. The code established criteria for distinguishing between changes that were necessary for survival and changes that would represent a fundamental betrayal of the organization's mission. These criteria weren't rigid rules that could be applied mechanically. They were principles that required judgment, wisdom, and a deep understanding of Hassan's original vision. This meant that only the most thoroughly indoctrinated leaders could be trusted to make decisions about how the order should evolve over time. The result was an organization that could adapt to new circumstances while maintaining its essential character across centuries. The assassins who operated in the 13th century were recognizably the same kind of organization that Hassan had founded in the 11th. Even though they were dealing with completely different political situations and using techniques that had been refined through generations of experience, this combination of flexibility and continuity was perhaps Hassan's greatest achievement as an organizational designer. He had created something that was simultaneously timeless and adaptive, capable of surviving the death of its founder and continuing to operate effectively long after the specific circumstances that had given rise to it had completely changed. The dark code of the assassins represents one of the most sophisticated attempts in human history to create a perfect system of human control and motivation. Every aspect of the organization, from its recruitment methods to its operational procedures to its long-term survival strategies, was designed according to principles that demonstrated a profound understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Hassan's achievement was how completely it succeeded. For over 2 centuries, the methods codified in his dark teachings allowed a relatively small group of fanatics to wield influence far beyond what their numbers would suggest was possible. They proved that with the right combination of ideology, conditioning, and organizational structure, human beings could be transformed into instruments of incredible precision and effectiveness. The legacy of their code extends far beyond the medieval period in which they operated. The techniques Hassan developed for creating absolute loyalty, for managing complex covert operations, for using fear as a strategic weapon, all of these have been studied and adapted by intelligence agencies and extremist organizations throughout history. And there, in the ruins of Alamut, scattered among the stones and ashes of a fortress that once held the world in terror, lies the most disturbing truth of all. The dark code of the assassins didn't die with Hassan-i-Sabah. It didn't crumble when the Mongols finally breached those impregnable walls. Because what Hassan had truly created wasn't just an organization or even a philosophy, it was a template, a blueprint for transforming human beings into perfect weapons of ideology. Today, when we see suicide bombers walking calmly toward their targets, when we witness the absolute devotion of extremist cells operating across the globe, when we marvel at the discipline and secrecy of modern terrorist networks, we're seeing the direct descendants of Hassan's dark code. The methods may have evolved, the technology may have advanced, but the fundamental principles remain exactly the same. Strip away individual identity, replace personal desires with collective purpose, make death seem more desirable than life, and create a system so perfectly designed that questioning it becomes literally unthinkable. The assassins proved something that should terrify us all. That with the right combination of isolation, indoctrination, and psychological manipulation, ordinary human beings can be transformed into creatures that serve purposes they never chose, follow orders they don't understand, and commit acts that would have horrified the people they used to be. They showed us that the human mind, for all its complexity and apparent independence, can be conquered as surely as any fortress if you understand the right techniques. So the next time you hear about an extremist organization that seems to operate with supernatural discipline, the next time you wonder how ordinary people become willing to die for abstract ideals, remember the dark code of the assassins. Because Hassani Saba didn't just create a medieval death cult, he discovered principles of human control that have echoed through history like a curse, shaping the methods of every organization that has ever sought to transform believers into weapons. And perhaps the most chilling thought of all is this. Somewhere out there, in some hidden fortress of the modern world, Hassan's dark code is still being written, still being refined, still being used to transform human beings into instruments of purposes they will never be allowed to understand. The assassins may be gone, but their legacy lives on in every shadow, where ideology meets desperation, where faith becomes fanaticism, and where human beings learn to embrace death as the ultimate expression of devotion. The code endures. And that should keep us all awake at night,